Every so often, a crime emerges that does more than shock a community. It leaves scars across an entire country. The murder of Loretta Saunders is one of those crimes. It is not just a story of violence, but of betrayal, of injustice, and of the haunting reality that some lives are treated with less care than others. Her case is a tragic example of how systemic failures can turn an individual's story into a symbol of something much larger. To understand the gravity of what happened to Loretta, we must look closely at who she was, what her life represented, and how her violent death sparked a national outcry. Loretta Saunders was not a forgotten figure. She was young, intelligent, and determined to make a difference. She grew up in Newfoundland and Labrador, part of the Inuit community, carrying with her both the pride and the struggles of her heritage. Her academic ambitions were enormous. She was studying criminology at St. Mary's University in Halifax, writing a thesis about missing and murdered Indigenous women. Loretta was not just researching a topic, she was documenting the very crisis that Indigenous women in Canada face. That detail makes her story even more disturbing, because she became the very kind of victim she was fighting to defend in her academic work. When Loretta was reported missing in February 2014, there was immediate concern. She was last seen at her apartment, a place she shared with tenants who were supposed to be temporary renters. The circumstances of her disappearance raised red flags quickly. Her family, friends, and professors knew that Loretta was responsible, dependable, and communicative. She would not vanish without explanation. Yet her sudden silence was exactly what happened, and it plunged everyone into panic. The initial search was frantic. Police, volunteers, and community members rallied to find answers. Every hour that passed felt heavier, because people knew the statistics. Indigenous women in Canada face a disproportionately high risk of violence and murder. Loretta herself had been studying these very facts, and her loved ones could not ignore the cruel irony. Days turned into weeks, and the dread intensified. When her body was finally found in a wooded area of New Brunswick, the confirmation of her death crushed all hope. She had been brutally murdered, and the details revealed a chilling betrayal. Her killers were not strangers lurking in the shadows. They were her own tenants, people she had trusted enough to live under the same roof. Blake Leggett and Victoria Henneberry, a couple struggling with their own unstable lives, were the ones who ended Loretta's future. They had financial troubles, emotional instability, and a manipulative streak that turned lethal. When Loretta pressed them to pay their rent or leave the apartment, tensions rose. Instead of leaving, they chose to kill her. Their actions were not a sudden burst of rage, but a calculated and horrifying decision. The brutality of the crime is what makes it unbearable to recount. Loretta's killers strangled her, stuffed her body into a hockey bag, and drove it across provincial lines before dumping it in a remote location. Every part of their act showed cold disregard for her humanity. They did not just kill her, they attempted to erase her existence. But Loretta was not someone who could be erased. Her story was too powerful, her identity too meaningful, and her death too symbolic of a crisis that had been ignored for far too long. The trial that followed was a window into the twisted psychology of her killers. Leggett pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, while Henneberry pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Their confessions left no doubt about their involvement, but their attempts to minimize responsibility only fueled public outrage. For many Canadians, it was not only about punishing the individuals responsible, it was about confronting the national shame of how Indigenous women are treated. Loretta's death was not isolated. It was one in a long chain of disappearances and murders that had stretched across decades, often without proper investigation or justice. This is where Loretta's case became bigger than one crime. She had been writing her thesis about missing and murdered Indigenous women. She had been documenting how systemic neglect contributed to the vulnerability of women like her. And then she became part of the very statistics she was trying to prevent. That cruel twist turned her into a symbol. Her professors later published her unfinished thesis as a way to honor her work. It was titled, "It's Complicated: An Investigation into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls." The publication of her work was not just an academic act, it was a national statement. It meant that her voice, though silenced, would still speak. Here is where I want you to pause and reflect. Imagine dedicating yourself to exposing a deadly problem, only to be consumed by it. Imagine working to shine light on injustice, and then being swallowed by the same darkness. That is what happened to Loretta Saunders. It is one of the most chilling examples of life and death colliding in ways too cruel to imagine. Her murder sparked vigils across Canada. People gathered with candles, posters, and tears. Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities came together to demand accountability. Her death became a turning point in the push for a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Eventually, that inquiry was launched. But many argue it came too late for Loretta and the countless others who died before her. Still, her story helped force the government to confront what had long been ignored. Loretta's case also exposed the role of trust and betrayal in violent crime. She had let Leggett and Henneberry into her home. She had given them a place to live. Instead of respecting that trust, they turned it into an opportunity to exploit and destroy. Their betrayal makes the crime feel even darker. It reminds us that danger is not always in the unknown, but sometimes in the familiar. That lesson is chilling because it challenges the sense of safety we all want to believe in. For true crime followers, Loretta's story is unforgettable. It combines the elements that make a case haunting a bright young life, a senseless act of violence, and a legacy that changes the national conversation. But beyond the horror, it is also about resilience. Her family has worked tirelessly to keep her memory alive. They refuse to let her story fade into silence. They speak her name, share her work, and ensure that her life is remembered as more than just a statistic. That act of remembrance is powerful, because it pushes back against the very forces that tried to erase her. There is another layer that makes Loretta's story disturbing: the banality of evil. Her killers were not masterminds. They were ordinary people who chose extraordinary cruelty. Their crime was not sophisticated, but it was devastating. That reality unsettles us because it suggests that violence is not always the work of monsters from outside society. Sometimes, it is the result of broken people making horrific choices in everyday settings. And when that happens, it is not just the victim who suffers, but an entire community that loses its sense of security. As you listen to this, I want you to consider how different her story could have been. If her tenants had simply left, she would have gone on to finish her thesis, perhaps become an advocate, maybe even a leader in reform. She could have used her voice to fight for others. Instead, her life was stolen. And that is what makes the case so unbearable. It is not just about the death of Loretta Saunders, it is about the death of possibility. The murder of Loretta Saunders is a reminder that crime does not happen in isolation. It happens in a social context, in a system that sometimes fails to protect the vulnerable. Her case highlights the urgent need to listen, to act, and to value every life equally. It is not enough to mourn. It is not enough to remember. Change is the only way to honor her. Her story calls for that change, and it continues to echo through Canada's conscience even years later. And now I want to leave you with a chilling thought. Loretta's killers tried to silence her. They tried to end her story. But in the end, they only made it louder. Her voice, through her work and through her memory, continues to speak. It speaks for her and for every other woman whose life was cut short. It demands justice, accountability, and remembrance. And it reminds us all that the true horror of crime is not only in the act itself, but in what is lost when a life full of promise is destroyed. Loretta Saunders' name is now a symbol of pain, of injustice, but also of courage and resilience. Her story is one that will never be forgotten, because it is more than a crime. It is a mirror held up to society, forcing us to see what we would rather look away from. And it is a reminder that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that echo after silence.